Guys, welcome to the Isle of Man, and you've been brought over by the Manx Dyslexia Association to a number of things during your visit. You're here between today and Monday, the 1st of April, and Thursday. Just give us a bit of a background to yourself first, please, and the work that you do.
Yeah, certainly. I do assessments. I've got a company based in Edinburgh, but I travel around and I do assessments for different learning difficulties. Dyslexia is really the main thing. And I work with people from primary age children to secondary age children, students at university, students at college, and adults in the workplace.
Can you tell us a little bit then about what's going on in the field of dyslexia and research and the work that you're doing at the moment then?
I think what's being discovered more and more is the amount of overlap there is between different learning difficulties. So that very often if somebody's dyslexic, they might also have a difficulty with numbers. They might also have some dyspraxic type of difficulties, difficulties with coordination. There's far more likelihood of a crossover than there is of somebody just having one difficulty. And something that I've found in the course of my work is that, well, one of the reasons I think that there is so much of this overlap is that there's an underlying thing that is common, and it's often to do with working memory difficulties. So we often find that somebody who's dyslexic has either got a difficulty with their working memory, that's like short-term memory, or a difficulty with processing speed. So we're looking much more now at the kind of cognitive things that are underpinning dyslexia.
So is it a case almost as if the pathways that they use for something like words and therefore results in dyslexia is the same as the pathway that they use for something else which results in the other condition? Is that what we're talking about in layman's terms here?
I think really if you think of somebody, especially when they're quite young in the classroom, if they're not actually retaining information long enough to process it at their level of ability, that is possibly going to lead to difficulties in then learning all of these core skills that we need for reading and writing. So the core skills of how words are put together. How do we spell a word if we've never tried spelling it before? How do we read a word that we've never seen before? And you're counting on having developed these core skills early. And if you can't develop them early because of difficulties with, say working memory or speed, then that can have a kind of knock-on effect later on.
So you're working on the assumption that something is innate rather than learnt?
It's a combination, I guess.
Or the mistake, that is made is that
yes.
you're working on that assumption.
Yeah. I think the thing is that, the theory would be that some people are innately, they have weaknesses in some of these cognitive areas, but the kind of learned aspect, that can be changed in the sense that if you change the way that you teach that person, then they are going to have a better chance of learning that information. So although they talk about dyslexia being a learning difficulty, it's much more a learning difference. It's a different way of learning, but it is difficult for the person who's trying to learn in the context of being taught the same way as everyone else in the class, and that's where it becomes a difficulty.
The old square pegs and round holes.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about this book then here, the big book of dyslexia, Activities for Kids and Teens. So you've been putting these theories into this book.
These are all things that have been used in the classroom in practice. So that was written with Gavin Reid and with Nick Guise, and Nick Guise was teaching with pupils and actually used an awful lot of these methods in class. So this is kind of based on the fact that if a person's got a difficulty with their memory or their speed, what you have to do is use lots of different senses, multisensory teaching, because they're much more liable to remember that information if it's been presented in lots of different ways, visual, auditory, tactile, all of that. And plus it's much more interesting for the teacher and for the pupils. And in fact, these activities, they would be useful right across children who don't have difficulties too. It makes it a much more interesting learning environment. So that's got about 100 different things that teachers could use that, they could open a page and say, how are we going to teach this geography lesson or this maths lesson or this history lesson? And it gives ideas of activities, but also I think it kind of teaches people the underpinning principle of why don't we open up our way of teaching and make it much more multisensory.
I understand. I've heard somewhere recently that laughter can be factored within that as well. If you can make someone laugh about something, not only does it get them to think about maybe things a little bit more from a different perspective, but in terms of the retention of that information, that's supposed to be more effective as well. Is that correct?
I guess the thing there would be that if you're laughing at something, that you're engaging with it quite a lot and it's active, you're participating. If all these things are happening, you're going to learn the thing much more easily. And clearly, if you're laughing, it's more enjoyable. So it has to be good.
And Sue Rutter from the Manx Dyslexia Association, I'll bring you in at this point. Sue, what have you got lined up for Dr. Guise this week, and how are you looking to get Dr. Guise to interact with the people here on the island who have dyslexia?
Well, initially we've brought Dr. Guise over because we were asked by the Isle of Man College to do some training for their lecturers and staff. And we felt that it would be good to bring somebody in. Last year we brought Dr. Gavin Reid in, who did some training for teachers and for parents. So this is a follow-on from that. That's happening tomorrow at the college at 4:30, and it's a twilight session. And I believe the Senkos from the schools are also going to attend. She very kindly has also offered to do a drop-in session for us for parents at the Henry Bloom Noble Library in Douglas on Wednesday between 6 and 8. You can book to have a 10-minute session with Dr. Guise on Eventbrite, or you can just turn up and chat, and there'll be members of the MDA as well. Also, Dr. Guise is doing some private assessments while she's here, parents who've been asking to try and get their children assessed, and obviously having somebody on the island rather than having to pay to go across is an advantage.
Dr. Guise, could you just give us a little insight what you would be able to provide in those 10 minutes if that's something that's of interest to parents out there?
I think what would be, very often people have got very specific questions relating to their child. Now what I find is that I see the same questions being asked, but for each individual parent it's very important that they get the advice that relates to their child. And often we're covering the same ground. We're talking about why it is that person might have a difficulty. And often parents want to know what they can do to help, as well as maybe what the school might be able to do. And often I would find, I guess, we're talking about things like exam accommodations, what kind of things might be appropriate, what kind of things might help that person, and also sometimes the kind of subject areas that they might be more interested in, that kind of thing.